Ladies and gentlemen, history at US colleges is suffering decline and fall faster than Gibbon's Roman Empire. The most recent data, released in March 2016 for degrees awarded in 2014, show that the number of history undergraduate degrees fell for the third time in 4 years, this time by a startling 9%. The biggest decline was at the country's most prestigious schools, where the number fell by more than 13%. Moreover, surveys indicate that between 2012 and 2015, overall undergraduate enrollment in history courses fell at 3/4 of all colleges. More than 2/5 of colleges saw declines of 10% or more. This is just the latest installment of a sustained slide since the early 1970s, and the decline seems likely to continue. The aggregate number of bachelor's level majors reported in the 2014 Directory of the American Historical Association is 19% lower than in 2009, so that the class of 2017 and 2018 is expected to have even fewer historians than the class of 2014. Now, there is a variety of social and economic explanations for this decline. However, I believe it is the changing content of history courses that is the best explanation. An article published by the AHA in December 2015 analysed the changes in history faculty specializations over the last 40 years on the basis of the association's Directory of History departments. The data reveal a very big increase in the number of historians who specialise in women and gender, which has risen from 1% of the total to almost 10%. This is now the single most important historical subfield in the academy. Cultural history, from under 4% to nearly 8%, is next. The history of race and ethnicity has also gone up by a factor of more than 3. Environmental history is another big winner. The losers in this structural shift are diplomatic and international history, legal and constitutional history, and intellectual history. Social and economic history have also declined. All of these have fallen to less than half their 1970 shares of the profession. I'd also expected to find comparable shifts in the regional focus of academic history. However, these have been quite limited. The share of US historians has remained relatively constant at around 41%. Faculty specialization in European history has declined, to be sure, from 39% in 1975 to 32% now, but that seems a pretty modest shift. Nevertheless, all these transformations of history as a discipline are generally celebrated as a triumph for diversity. I fear this triumph has come at a significant price. If one poses the question, what are the most significant events in modern history? No two people, and certainly no two historians, would give the same answer. For years, terms such as significant or important have been more or less prescribed in the academy for fear of privileging the history of elites. Indeed, even the word event was regarded with disdain by members of the Annales school. Yet when historians complain, as some now do, that their profession has, I quote, ceded the public arena nationally as well as globally to the economists and occasionally lawyers and political scientists, they implicitly acknowledge that the priorities of the public arena should not be irrelevant to them. Not all historical subjects are equal in the public arena. I submit to you that a list of significant historical subjects that omitted the majority of the following 20 would be regarded as incomplete in the eyes of any reputable newspaper, magazine, textbook, or encyclopedia publisher. Number 1, any period of British history. Number 2, I'm just getting started. Number 2, the Reformation. Number 3, the Scientific Revolution. Number 4, the Enlightenment. The American Revolution. The French Revolution. The US Constitution. The Industrial Revolution. The American Civil War. German unification. World War I. The Russian Revolution. The Great Depression. The rise of fascism. The Third Reich. World War II. Decolonization. The Cold War. The history of Israel. European integration. 20. In assessing the range of courses provided by 3 major US history departments, those of Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, I have simply used this list as a benchmark. If you were an undergraduate at one of these institutions in the fall of 2016, which of these 20 subjects would you find covered by the courses on offer to you? The answer, in the case of Harvard, is not many. To be precise, a historically inclined student would look in vain for a course on all but 7 of the 20. And German unification, fascism, and the Third Reich are covered by a single course. There are also courses that cover the Russian Revolution, the Great Depression, the Cold War, and European integration. Now, this seems a somewhat meager showing for a department that lists 55 faculty members, of whom only 7 are listed as being on leave this semester. 20 Harvard historians, 20, are listed as specialists in the history of the United States. And yet, this semester at least, the undergraduate has looked in vain for education about the American Revolution, the Constitution, and the Civil War. The picture at Yale looks at first sight better, until one realizes that nearly all the coverage is provided by just 2 courses. John Merriman's Hist 202, European Civilization 1684 to 1945, and Paul Kennedy's Hist 221, Military History of the West since 1500. Aside from these 2, only 4 other faculty members of a department numbering 67, mind you, are engaged in teaching any of the 20 topics on my list. Similarly, at Stanford, just 6 courses are on offer that relate to the 20 topics, leaving 42 members whose interests would seem to lie elsewhere. Now, this is not to say that the other courses available at these 3 universities are without value. It is to say that undergraduates looking to increase their familiarity with publicly significant events in modern history would be justified in feeling short-changed. These findings are all the more surprising when one reflects on the relative stability of the geographical focus of history departments on American and European history. To understand why history is an academic discipline in decline, it's worth looking at some of the courses that are available at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale this fall. Are you sitting comfortably? Take, for example, Harvard's History 1954, Emotions in History. The course description is as follows. What is the place of emotion in history? We will explore some possible analytic frames for the history of emotion and debates over the subjectivity of history, and consider their application to case studies drawn from Australian history. Now, it strikes me as not wholly surprising that this course has, according to the My Harvard site, a total enrollment of 1. Or consider the following course titles available at Yale: History 4XXJ, Indigenous Religious Histories. History 1XXJ, Witchcraft and Society in Colonial America. History 283, History of the Supernatural. History 260J, Sex, Life and Generation. All fascinating, no doubt. But as my doctoral advisor invariably asked whenever I proposed a dissertation topic, so what? Stanford's History 41Q is entitled Mad Women, the History of Women and Mental Illness in the US. It entices potential students by proposing to, and I quote, explore how gender has shaped the experience and treatment of mental illness in US history, and asking the question, why have women been the witches and hysterics of the past? Think about that for a minute, because I don't think men can be witches or hysterics, can they? Now, this is not to say that it's a silly question, just that it's a less important question than how the United States became an independent republic with a constitution based on the idea of limited government, or how it survived a civil war over the institution of slavery. It just seems less important than that. There are two problems with the new history that's displaced the old. The first is that some of it's so disconnected from our contemporary concerns that it is little better than the antiquarianism scoffed at by the philosophe 250 years ago. The cultural history classes I've been forced to take at Harvard in order to graduate verge on heirloom antiquarianism, a current undergraduate recently told me. Generally, they focus on the customs of a small subset of an ethnic population within a certain area at a certain time. One gets to know the habits of New York restaurant goers in the 1870s, or the makeup of various Caribbean ethnic groups in areas of Brooklyn that made up the West Indian Day Parade in the 1960s. Real examples from my last year, very well. But the subject matter is so obscure that any hope for comparison or relevance is lost. The second problem is that such microcosmographia academica is so often accompanied by overt politicization. Indeed, some of it is so skewed by contemporary concerns that it is fundamentally unhistorical. For example, Stanford's History 3A, Making Palestine Visible, claims to show, and I quote, how Palestinian claims to rights have been rendered illegible for much of the American public. The course description goes on, this learning experience incorporating discussion and clarification at its core connects with the national and Stanford campus discussion of activism on Israel-Palestine, end quote. The same university's History 263D, Junipero Serra, requires students to participate in a, quote, formal debate on the ethics naming university or public buildings after historical figures with contested pasts, end quote. To suggest that there's anything wrong with this kind of thing is to take a great risk in our age of trigger warnings and safe spaces. But I'm fairly certain there is something wrong with it. Namely, the overt importation into the classroom of politics. A practice that Max Weber rightly condemned in his Science as a Vocation. Courses such as these, ladies and gentlemen, are part of what might be called an anachronistic turn, an impulse to judge the past by the moral standards of the present, and even to efface its traces in a kind of modern-day iconoclasm when these are deemed offensive. History, in short, is in trouble. History departments neglect the defining events of modern world history in favor of topics that either are arcane or are agitprop, and sometimes both. The result has been a sustained and eminently predictable decline in history enrollments. the long-term effects on the elite who are educated at top American universities are, I think, unlikely to be positive. The United States of amnesia will get no better at learning from history if the people who end up running the Republic know next to none at all. I believe trustees and alumni have a vitally important role to play in responding to the decline and fall of history in our universities. I also believe that they will find allies amongst the large numbers of undergraduates who thirst to study applied history rather than the antiquarian or anachronistic options with which they are increasingly presented. Let me be frank in my conclusion. I have come to doubt that the pathologies that I've described within our history departments can be cured. Strange though it seems to me, those who have driven this transformation of history are too deeply entrenched in these institutions and too committed to their cause to pay heed to the declining enrollments. I sometimes think that some of them would rather ply their trade in empty classrooms than appoint a single junior professor who studies and teaches the subjects that I have the temerity to call important. And yet, we, especially in our roles as trustees and alumni of great universities, cannot afford to subcontract the historical education of our fellow citizens to the composers of hip-hop musicals. As Lin-Manuel Miranda's libretto puts it, history has its eyes on us, even if we do not sufficiently have our eyes on it. Thank you very much indeed.